At 200 feet below the surface, holding a 2,000-ton Soviet nuclear submarine, the steel began to fail. Pipe section 147 was tearing apart. 3 miles of connected pipe hung below, $800 million suspended in the balance. The operators had maybe 30 seconds to decide: continue the lift and risk catastrophic failure, or stop and watch 6 years of work sink back into the abyss. This is the story of how that impossible moment happened, how the CIA built a ship with a hole in its bottom, told the world it was for mining rocks, and used it to steal a Soviet submarine from the deepest salvage operation ever attempted. 98 dead sailors entombed inside, nuclear missiles in the payload bay, encryption machines that could unlock years of Soviet secrets. All of it 3 miles underwater, deeper than Mount Everest is tall, in crushing pressure that would implode a car like a crushed soda can. The mission was called Project AZORIAN. It cost more than the Apollo 13 rescue, more than 5 B-2 stealth bombers, more than most countries spend on their entire military in a year, and it almost worked. 6 years earlier, at 3 in the morning on March 9, 1968, Carl Duckett answered his phone. The CIA's Deputy Director for Science and Technology picked up on the second ring. A Navy commander was calling from Hawaii. They'd found something: a Soviet submarine, Gulf-class ballistic missile boat, at the bottom of the Pacific, 16,500 feet down. Duckett sat up. The commander explained the boat had suffered catastrophic failure the day before. They'd picked up an explosion signature. The submarine never surfaced. The Soviets were searching frantically, but they were looking hundreds of miles off target. They had no idea where their boat actually was. Think about what that meant. A Soviet nuclear submarine intact on the ocean floor with R-21 ballistic missiles carrying 1 megaton warheads, codebooks, cipher machines, navigation systems, just sitting there, and the Soviets couldn't find it. Duckett didn't go back to sleep. By dawn, he was already sketching plans for the most audacious theft in Cold War history. The submarine was K-129. It carried 3 nuclear missiles capable of hitting American cities, 6 nuclear torpedoes, and the latest Soviet naval encryption systems. The crew of 98 men were now entombed in a steel coffin at a depth that made the Titanic look shallow. The Titanic sits at 12,500 feet. K-129 was 4,000 feet deeper. Within a week, the CIA convened a special task force with a deliberately boring code name, Project AZORIAN. The team included engineers from Lockheed, naval architects, and deep-sea salvage experts. Their mission was straightforward in concept, but staggering in execution: recover the submarine without the Soviets knowing. The depth exceeded every existing salvage record by a factor of 3. The pressure at 16,500 feet, 5,000 pounds per square inch, would crush conventional equipment instantly. The submarine weighed 2,000 tons. No crane on Earth could lift that weight from that depth. They would need to invent entirely new technology in secret, without the Soviets noticing a massive salvage operation directly above their lost submarine. John Parangosky took charge. He assembled his core team in Virginia and laid out the fundamental problem. They needed a ship capable of hovering precisely over a target point, lowering a capture mechanism 3 miles straight down, grasping a 2,000-ton submarine, and lifting it back up, all while looking like a completely normal civilian vessel, because the Soviet Navy would be watching. Any U.S. government vessel operating near a Soviet submarine loss would trigger immediate suspicion. The operation required commercial cover, something plausible enough to explain weeks of stationary positioning over a random patch of ocean. The solution came from deep-sea mining. In the early 70s, mining companies were exploring harvesting manganese nodules from the ocean floor. The technology was experimental and the economics questionable, but several companies had announced ambitious plans. It was perfect cover, weird enough to be believable, boring enough to not attract attention. But they needed a front company. The cover story had to withstand scrutiny from Soviet intelligence, American journalists, and the actual mining industry. They needed someone eccentric enough To pursue an unlikely venture with a history of classified defense work, they needed Howard Hughes. By 1974, Hughes was already a legendary recluse, locked in a Las Vegas hotel penthouse, conducting business through trusted aides. His companies had built aircraft for the military. He was known for pursuing unconventional business ventures that made little financial sense. The Spruce Goose had cost millions and served no practical purpose. Hughes was the perfect front for an $800 million ship that would officially mine rocks. The CIA approached Raymond Holliday, senior vice president of Hughes's Summa Corporation. The agency explained they needed Hughes's name and corporate infrastructure for a sensitive operation with presidential approval. Holliday flew to Las Vegas and explained the opportunity to Hughes in a darkened hotel room. Hughes asked one question: would this help the country? Holliday confirmed it would. Hughes gave immediate approval. The agency created Hughes Glomar Marine Development Corporation. On paper, it existed to develop deep-sea mining technology. Industry publications covered the announcement with mild interest. The story held together because it was partially true. Parangosky turned to Sun Shipbuilding in Philadelphia. The contract specified a vessel unlike anything built before, 619 feet long with dynamic positioning systems and a derrick tower reaching 250 feet above deck. Most critically, the ship required a moon pool, a 40-foot wide hole straight through the ship's bottom with massive doors that could seal it off. Inside that space, invisible to anyone watching from outside, they would lift an entire submarine. The design called for a capture vehicle they named Clementine. This enormous mechanical claw would descend on connected pipe sections, grasp the submarine at depth, and be winched back up through the moon pool. Clementine alone weighed thousands of tons and incorporated hydraulic systems capable of exerting precise control where the pressure exceeded anything humans had ever worked with. Construction began in early '71. The costs climbed relentlessly. The ship alone consumed over $200 million. Everything together pushed toward $800 million, roughly $5 billion in today's money. The single most expensive covert operation the CIA had ever attempted. Parangosky faced constant pressure from oversight committees. He argued that recovering Soviet encryption systems alone could provide years of advantage. But the real prize was simpler. If they could lift a submarine from 3 miles down, in secret, under Soviet surveillance, then no ocean grave was safe. The Soviets would know that everything they threw in the ocean could potentially be recovered and analyzed. The Glomar Explorer completed construction in late '73. Sea trials showed the ship performing beyond expectations. The crew trained until they could execute operations without visible coordination. One challenge remained: they needed precise coordinates for K-129. The Navy deployed the bathyscaphe Trieste II. Over several weeks, it conducted methodical search patterns. In August '74, they found it. The submarine rested at a slight angle, partially broken but largely intact. The bow section appeared relatively undamaged. The conning tower stood upright. Most importantly, the forward compartment containing the code room looked intact. Parangosky received confirmation in early September. The mission was approved for execution. The Glomar Explorer would sail within weeks. The operation required absolute secrecy through a split crew. About half the personnel genuinely believed they were conducting mining operations. The other half were CIA officers who knew the true mission. The cover crew received detailed briefings on manganese nodule mining. They genuinely believed they were making history as the world's first industrial deep-sea mining operation. President Nixon had approved Azorian before Watergate consumed his presidency. By the time the ship was ready to sail, Gerald Ford occupied the Oval Office. Ford's advisors debated whether to proceed. The costs were sunk. The potential intelligence remained compelling. Ford authorized the operation to proceed. On October 1st, '74, the Glomar Explorer departed Long Beach, California. The crew numbered 178. 40 knew the real mission. The voyage west took 11 days. When the ship reached target coordinates and began positioning operations, 2 Soviet vessels appeared on radar, maintaining surveillance positions at roughly 10 nautical miles. The Glomar Explorer activated dynamic positioning and locked onto coordinates. The derrick crew began assembling the pipe string section by section. Each pipe section measured 60 feet and weighed several tons. They would need approximately 290 sections to reach the ocean floor, over 3 miles of connected pipe, each connection a potential failure point. The descent began on October 4th. 23 hours later, Clementine touched bottom. Sonar painted a picture of surrounding terrain, and there it was, K-129, lying at exactly 16,500 feet. The submarine appeared longer than expected. Clementine needed to position precisely along the center of mass. Using minimal thruster burns to avoid disturbing sediment, operators maneuvered Clementine into position above the submarine. The vehicle featured 8 mechanical arms designed to wrap around the hull and lock into place. The process took 6 days of constant adjustment, testing, repositioning. On October 10th, all 8 arms achieved secure lock. Parangoski gave the order to proceed with the main lift. The ascent began at dawn on October 11th. Slowly, incredibly slowly, the submarine began moving, rising, coming up from its grave after 6 years. The first 2,000 feet went smoothly. Then, at 14,000 feet depth, stress monitors registered an anomaly in pipe section 147. The connection was weakening. The operators could see it in real time, load distribution shifting, the pipe beginning to bend. They slowed the ascent rate, but damage was already developing. Metal fatigue had found a microscopic flaw in the weld, and now that flaw was propagating, threatening complete failure. Parangoski faced an impossible decision: continue and risk catastrophic failure, or stop and attempt repairs at depth, which might not be possible. Structural engineers calculated they had perhaps 30 minutes before connection failure. The submarine hung suspended at 12,000 feet, too deep to recover if it fell, too close to surface to abandon. Parangoski made the call. They would continue the lift but vary the ascent rate, changing speed to alter stress patterns, hoping to buy enough time to get past the damaged section. It was desperate. It was the only option that didn't guarantee failure. The operators adjusted winch speed in precise increments. The technique was called dynamic load management, and it had never been tested under these conditions. Section 147 held, barely. The stress monitors showed the connection operating at 97% of failure threshold. But the submarine continued rising. At 9,000 feet, stress readings began dropping. The damaged section passed through the moon pool and locked into the derrick support structure. The immediate crisis was over, but K-129 now hung at 6,000 feet with more than an hour of lifting ahead. At 3,000 feet, first visual confirmation came through. Clementine's cameras sent back grainy images. The bow section appeared intact, but the rear third showed significant damage. Hull plates torn away, internal structures exposed. The explosion that killed K-129 had occurred in the stern. Parangoski watched the video feed. The damage was worse than photographs had suggested. The submarine was barely holding together. Engineers ran numbers and delivered bad news. The submarine's weight distribution had shifted. Most of the mass was now forward, which put enormous stress on the center section where the arms were gripping. The submarine might break in half before they got it to the surface. At 1,500 feet, operators saw movement in the video feed. A section of hull plating near the stern separated and tumbled away. Then another piece broke free. The submarine was shedding weight from the rear, making the balance problem worse. The mechanical arms were now holding essentially the front 2/3 of a submarine, with the back third slowly disintegrating. Here's what the operators knew at that moment. They had Soviet nuclear weapons coming up through international waters. They had classified Soviet technology. They had the bodies of nearly 100 men who had families. And they had all of it hanging by corroded metal that was giving way piece by piece. At 700 feet, another section gave way, a piece of outer pressure hull approximately 20 feet long. The entire stern assembly was now hanging by compromised structure. The video feed showed seawater streaming from torn seams as the submarine rose through different pressure zones. At 200 feet, K-129 broke. The sound came first, a deep metallic groan that resonated through the water and into the ship's hull. Then, sensors registered sudden load shift. The submarine's center section had fractured. The rear third of the submarine, including the propulsion system, the rear torpedo room, and critically, the missile compartment with 3 nuclear warheads, tore away and disappeared. The mechanical arms held firm, but they were now clutching only the forward section. The missiles were gone. The primary intelligence target of the entire $800 million operation had just fallen back into the abyss. Parangosky made the decision in seconds: continue the lift. They'd lost the missiles and propulsion systems, but the bow contained the code room, navigation systems, and most of the crew spaces. They would recover what they had. Half a submarine was better than nothing. The final 200 feet took 20 minutes. The forward section held. The submarine broke the surface inside the moon pool at 1400 hours on October 12th, 74. The capture vehicle rose into the ship's interior, water streaming from the wreckage, and settled onto the receiving platform. The moon pool doors closed immediately. The Soviet surveillance vessels had no reason to suspect anything more interesting than routine mining operations had occurred. Inside the ship, reality was different. The crew had just recovered a section of Soviet nuclear submarine from the deepest salvage operation ever attempted. They'd lost more than half the target, but they'd succeeded in bringing up something that should have been impossible to reach. Radiation monitors swept the wreckage. The readings came back negative for major contamination, but positive for residual radioactivity. The torpedoes were there. The CIA technical teams needed to enter the wreckage, but they couldn't simply cut their way in. The submarine was a tomb. Parangosky ordered teams to proceed carefully, document everything, and treat any remains with respect. The initial entry team wore full protective gear. They cut through the forward hatch and entered the officers' quarters. The interior was in surprisingly good condition. The pressure hull had maintained integrity in forward sections. Bunks still had bedding. Lockers contained personal effects. The control room instruments were intact, and yes, there were bodies. The team found 6 crew members in the forward section. These were someone's sons, someone's husbands, someone's fathers. The CIA made a decision that surprised some of the operational team. They would give these men a proper burial. It served no intelligence purpose, but it was the right thing to do. The burial at sea occurred that night. The 6 bodies were sewn into canvas bags, weighted, and prepared for military funeral honors. A chaplain conducted the service. The crew assembled on deck, and at 2200 hours, the bodies were committed to the ocean with full ceremony. The CIA filmed the entire burial, narrating each step in Russian, creating a record that would eventually be delivered to the Soviet Union decades later as a gesture of diplomatic goodwill. With the burial complete, teams returned to intelligence collection. The code room was a priority target. The team found it partially flooded and most paper materials destroyed by seawater, but the cipher machines themselves were still there, corroded but potentially salvageable. The torpedo room yielded 2 nuclear-armed Type 53 torpedoes. The navigation systems provided useful information about Soviet guidance technology, but they couldn't find what they'd really come for. The missile section was gone, sitting on the ocean floor 3 miles down. The R-21 ballistic missiles with their 1 megaton nuclear warheads had fallen back into the abyss. The most valuable intelligence target had slipped away at 200 feet. Parangosky received inventory reports and absorbed the scope of what they'd achieved and what they'd lost. They had a partial submarine, some weapons, some equipment, 6 bodies that had been buried honorably. The cost-benefit calculation had shifted dramatically. $800 million for degraded tactical intelligence and a demonstration of technical capability. The operation was simultaneously a triumph of engineering and a failure of intelligence collection. On October 16th, 4 days after recovery, the Glomar Explorer departed the site and set course for Hawaii. The mission was complete in the sense that they'd recovered something. It had failed in the sense that they'd missed the primary targets. The Soviet surveillance vessels followed for a while, then broke off. They'd watched an American mining ship conduct boring operations for several days and then leave. Nothing suggested anything unusual had occurred. The secret was holding, but secrets don't last forever. In June '74, during the preparation phase, a burglar broke into Howard Hughes' headquarters in Los Angeles, looking for money and valuable papers. What he found instead was a filing cabinet containing documents related to the Glomar Explorer project. The burglar recognized the documents were classified and began shopping them. The CIA learned about the theft within days. The documents didn't contain direct references to submarine recovery, but they established a connection between Hughes and a classified government project. That was enough to start unraveling the cover story. The agency launched damage control, but the documents had already changed hands multiple times. By December '74, copies had reached journalists. The CIA contacted major media organizations and requested they not publish information about the Glomar Explorer. Several major newspapers agreed to hold the story. One journalist, however, decided the story was too important to suppress. Jack Anderson ran a nationally syndicated column that specialized in government secrets. His philosophy was straightforward. The public had a right to know what their government was doing with $800 million. When his staff began researching the Glomar Explorer, they uncovered enough independent sources to confirm the basic story. Anderson planned to publish in February '75. CIA Director William Colby personally contacted Anderson and explained that publication would compromise ongoing operations. Anderson remained unconvinced. The operation was already complete. What ongoing operations could possibly be compromised? The story ran on February 18, '75. Anderson reported that the CIA had used a Howard Hughes ship to recover a Soviet submarine from the Pacific Ocean floor. The column appeared in hundreds of newspapers across the country. By afternoon, it was the lead story on evening news broadcasts. The CIA refused to comment, invoking what would become a famous phrase: the agency could neither confirm nor deny the story. This particular response would later become formalized as the Glomar response, a legal doctrine used in Freedom of Information Act cases. The agency's refusal to acknowledge the story was itself confirmation for most observers. The Soviet Union's reaction was more measured than the CIA had feared. The Soviet Navy had known they'd lost K-1 129 in '68. They'd conducted extensive searches and failed to find the wreck. Learning that the Americans had located and partially recovered it was embarrassing, but not strategically catastrophic. The submarine's cryptographic systems had been updated multiple times since '68. What bothered the Soviets more was the principle. If the Americans could recover a submarine from 16,000 feet, then no Soviet naval loss was truly permanent. Every sunken vessel could potentially be recovered and analyzed. The ocean was no longer a guaranteed disposal method. Diplomatic protests followed. The Soviet ambassador delivered a formal complaint about violation of a military gravesite. The State Department responded that it had no comment on alleged intelligence operations. The exchange was sharp, but remained within normal diplomatic boundaries. But here's what nobody outside the intelligence community knew. The recovered materials were more valuable than the CIA publicly acknowledged, even while being less valuable than they'd hoped. The cipher machines revealed design philosophies that helped cryptanalysts understand Soviet naval encryption. The navigation systems showed targeting capabilities that adjusted American estimates. The torpedo designs confirmed that Soviet tactical nuclear weapons were more sophisticated than some analysts had believed. The submarine's construction told a story. American naval engineers studied every weld, every hull plate. They found evidence of rushed manufacturing, of corners cut, of maintenance issues inadequately addressed. K-129 had been repaired multiple times before its final voyage. This suggested Soviet submarine maintenance standards might be compromised across their fleet. The question naturally arose whether to attempt a second recovery. The Glomar Explorer still existed. The coordinates of the remaining wreckage were known precisely. The analysis showed recovering the stern section would actually be more difficult than the first attempt. More critically, the security situation had changed completely. The Soviets now knew about the Glomar Explorer. Any attempt to return would be met with immediate Soviet response. The element of surprise was gone forever. The CIA decided against a second mission. Project AZORIAN was officially terminated. The remaining wreckage would stay on the ocean floor indefinitely. The ship had an interesting afterlife. Eventually, the Glomar Explorer was converted for use in the offshore oil industry. The deep-water drilling capabilities developed as cover for submarine recovery turned out to have genuine commercial value. The ship worked for decades under its original name. The world's most expensive spy ship became an oil platform. The cover story became reality. The legacy of Project AZORIAN extended far beyond the ship. The Glomar response became standard practice for intelligence agencies. The technical achievements influenced submarine design and recovery operations for years. The deep-sea engineering techniques found applications in offshore oil drilling, scientific research, and telecommunications cable laying. The intelligence mission had generated civilian technology spin-offs worth potentially more than the intelligence gained. The families of K-129's crew had lived for years without knowing what happened to their loved ones. The Soviet Navy had told them only that the submarine was lost at sea. When the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, information began to emerge. In '92, Russian officials finally acknowledged the K-129 loss publicly. The CIA made a decision during this period of improved relations. The film of the burial at sea, preserved in classified archives, would be provided to the Russian government as a gesture of respect. CIA Director Robert Gates traveled to Moscow and presented the film to Russian officials. The ceremony was private, but emotionally significant. The film showed the 6 canvas-wrapped bodies being prepared for burial. It showed the American crew assembled on deck. It showed the chaplain conducting the service. The CIA had narrated the ceremony in Russian at the time it was filmed. Each step of the burial was explained. Each prayer was translated. The bodies were committed to the sea with dignity. Russian officials arranged for family members to view the film. Not all families chose to watch. Those who did saw evidence that their family members, even in death, even in the midst of an espionage operation, had been treated with respect. One widow described feeling grateful to the American sailors who had stood on deck that night. Here's something that wouldn't emerge for decades. The recovery hadn't been the clean operation that official reports suggested. When K-129's forward section broke the surface inside the moon pool, it was hemorrhaging materials. As the wreckage rose through different pressure zones, internal compartments collapsed. Equipment fell through the torn hull plates. The recovery area filled with debris. Crew members later described the scene as chaotic and disturbing. The submarine had been a tomb for 6 years, and now it was disgorging its contents. Personal items recovered from crew quarters provided unexpected insights. Photographs showed family scenes, children, wives, parents. Letters revealed relationships, hopes, fears. One sailor had been writing poetry, the pages still legible despite years underwater. Another had kept a diary documenting mundane details of submarine duty. These materials had no direct intelligence value, but they humanized the men who had died. The technical failure that caused the submarine to break was analyzed extensively. The stress calculations had been accurate, but they'd been based on assumptions about the submarine's structural condition that turned out to be wrong. The metal had been more corroded than external surveys could detect. Engineers determined that no reasonable design change would have prevented it. The failure was essentially inevitable. The operation had pushed human capability to its absolute limit, and discovered that limit was just slightly short of what was needed. The question of what the Soviet Union actually knew generated endless debate. Declassified Soviet documents from the post-Cold War era provided some answers. Soviet naval intelligence had indeed questioned the Glomar explorers' activities. Reports noted that the American ship's behavior was unusual for mining operations, but the reports didn't trigger higher-level investigation. Here's why. The Soviet Navy had lost track of K-129's location. Their search grid had been off by hundreds of miles. When surveillance vessels reported an American mining ship conducting unusual operations, Soviet intelligence didn't connect it to the lost submarine. They had the pieces of the puzzle, but never assembled them. This failure was itself revealing. Their surveillance capabilities were extensive, but their analytical capacity struggled to connect disparate pieces of information. The long-term strategic impact was subtle but significant. The Americans had proven they could reach targets at extreme depths. The Soviets had to assume that no maritime asset was permanently lost or secure. Soviet submarines began carrying more elaborate systems for destroying classified materials in emergencies. The psychological impact of knowing that even the ocean floor wasn't secure changed Soviet naval planning. Compare that to modern technology. In '74, reaching 16,000 feet was at the absolute edge of human capability. Today, remotely operated vehicles routinely work at those depths. The Titan submersible that imploded in 2023 while trying to reach the Titanic was attempting to reach less than 13,000 feet, shallow compared to K-129. Parangosky's own assessment, shared in internal CIA discussions years later, was characteristically blunt. They had attempted something unprecedented and had partially succeeded. The intelligence gained was useful but not transformative. If presented with the same decision again, knowing what he knew now, he wasn't certain he would approve the operation. But given the information available at the time and the strategic context of the Cold War, the decision to proceed had been reasonable. This ambivalence captured the essential truth about Project AZORIAN. It was neither the triumph that its supporters claimed, nor the disaster that its critics charged. It was an intelligence operation that achieved some objectives while failing others, that demonstrated impressive capabilities while revealing significant limitations. The physical remains of K-129 still rest on the Pacific floor today. The stern section sits where it fell in '74. The site is marked on classified maps maintained by the U.S. Navy and the Russian Navy. Neither country has attempted further recovery. But here's something most people don't know. The 3 nuclear missiles are still down there. 3 R-21 ballistic missiles, each carrying a 1-megaton warhead, sitting in corroded launch tubes 3 miles underwater. Modern technology could reach them. Remotely operated vehicles could survey the wreckage and potentially retrieve components. The technical capability exists, but nobody's going to do it. Russia would object strenuously. Environmental groups would raise concerns. The costs would be substantial. And the intelligence value of 50-year-old missile technology is essentially zero. The missiles will stay where they are, gradually corroding, eventually disintegrating, becoming part of the ocean floor sediment over centuries. The families of K-129's crew received formal recognition from the Russian government in the 2000s. A memorial was erected in Vladivostok, honoring the lost submariners. The names of all 98 crew members were inscribed on the monument. The 6 sailors buried at sea were eventually identified through forensic analysis. Their families learned which of the recovered bodies belonged to their relatives. The Russian Navy formally thanked the American sailors who had conducted the ceremony. One detail from the burial ceremony particularly resonated. The American chaplain had conducted the service according to Russian Orthodox traditions as closely as he could manage. He'd researched the proper prayers and procedures. He'd treated the service not as a formality, but as a genuine religious ceremony. The sailors had stood at attention in genuine respect. The film captured something real. The historical assessment of Project AZORIAN continues to evolve. The recovered navigation data showed that K-129 had been running patrol patterns closer to American waters than Soviet naval doctrine theoretically allowed. This raised questions about whether the submarine had been on a special mission or whether Soviet submarines routinely operated closer to American territory than publicly acknowledged. The submarine's maintenance records showed that K-129 had been experiencing problems before its final voyage. Battery issues had been reported multiple times. The submarine should probably have been in port for extended maintenance, but it had been sent on patrol anyway. This suggested Soviet submarine operations were being pushed harder than their maintenance infrastructure could support. The poetry written by one of the sailors became unexpectedly significant. The poems, preserved in a waterproof notebook, were surprisingly good. Thoughtful reflections on the sea, on separation from family, on the peculiar isolation of submarine duty. Eventually, decades later, the poems were provided to Russian authorities, who published them in a memorial book about K-129. The sailor's widow learned that her husband had been writing poetry she'd never seen. These human details complicated the narrative. It was easy to think of Project AZORIAN as purely a technical achievement or intelligence failure, but it was also a story about people, American sailors conducting a secret mission, Soviet sailors who died in service to their country, families on both sides dealing with loss and secrecy, and eventual partial closure. The crew members who had worked on the Glomar Explorer carried their experiences differently. Those who believed they were conducting mining operations learned years later what they'd actually been part of. Some felt betrayed by the deception. Others understood the necessity of compartmentalization. The crew members who knew the true mission maintained their secrecy for decades, unable to share their achievement even with family members. One shipyard welder later described working on the moon pool structure. The specifications had been extraordinarily precise, tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. He'd assumed it was typical government over-engineering. Learning years later that those specifications had been literally life or death requirements for an operation 3 miles underwater changed his understanding. The precision hadn't been bureaucratic excess, it had been survival engineering. The moment when K-129 broke during recovery was seared into every crew member's memory. The sound of metal tearing, the sudden alarm from the stress monitors, the realization that half the submarine was falling away after 6 years of planning. One operator described it as watching victory turn to partial failure in slow motion. They'd been so close, 200 feet, and then the submarine tore apart in their grip. Perhaps the most significant legacy was what it revealed about the limits of technical intelligence collection. The operation had pushed human capability to its absolute edge. They'd built a ship unlike anything before. They'd developed technology that didn't previously exist. They'd executed an operation of unprecedented complexity. They'd succeeded in recovering something that should have been impossible to reach, and they'd still lost half the target. The most valuable intelligence objectives had fallen back into the abyss at the moment of apparent success. All the money, all the effort, all the technical brilliance couldn't overcome the simple fact that the submarine's metal was too corroded to withstand the stress. Human capability had limits. Physics had limits. Sometimes those limits couldn't be overcome regardless of resources or determination. This lesson influenced intelligence operations for decades afterward. Technical intelligence became more focused on achievable objectives rather than maximum ambitions. The philosophy shifted from what do we want to recover to what can we realistically recover given the constraints we face. The operation's ultimate significance may lie in what it revealed about Cold War competition itself. Both superpowers invested enormous resources in gaining marginal advantages. They developed extraordinary capabilities in service of strategic objectives that were often more symbolic than practical. They operated in secrecy while knowing that secrecy was temporary and exposure was likely. Consider what the operation meant in practical terms. The United States spent $800 million to partially recover a submarine that yielded useful but not transformative intelligence. The Soviet Union lost 98 sailors to mechanical failure that might have been prevented with better maintenance. Both nations conducted the Cold War as though small advantages could shift the balance of power. Both nations were probably wrong about the actual strategic value of those small advantages. Yet the competition drove extraordinary achievements. Project AZORIAN pushed engineering boundaries. It developed technologies with civilian applications. It demonstrated that humans could work at depths previously thought inaccessible. These achievements had value beyond intelligence collection. The story of Project AZORIAN is ultimately a story about ambition and limitation. Ambition drove the CIA to attempt something unprecedented. Limitation determined that they would succeed only partially. Ambition created a ship capable of reaching the ocean floor. Limitation meant that what they found there would break apart in their grip. Here's the final revelation that ties everything together. In 2018, long after the Cold War ended, a former CIA officer revealed something that had never been publicly disclosed. The agency had actually considered sabotaging the recovery deliberately. The reasoning went like this. If they recovered the entire submarine intact, including the nuclear missiles, the intelligence gain would be substantial, but the diplomatic consequences could be severe. The Soviet Union might interpret a successful recovery as an act of war. But if the recovery failed partially, if the submarine broke during lifting, and the Americans recovered only some components, then the operation could be characterized as an ambitious attempt that achieved mixed results. The partial failure would be disappointing, but diplomatically manageable. Some CIA officers had argued for deliberately weakening Pipe Section 147. They could introduce a controlled failure point that would cause the submarine to break at a predetermined moment, allowing recovery of the forward section while losing the more provocative missile section. The partial failure would look like bad luck rather than deliberate design. The proposal was considered seriously and ultimately rejected. The officers decided that introducing deliberate failure points was too risky. They couldn't predict exactly how the submarine would break. A controlled failure might become an uncontrolled catastrophe, and deliberately sabotaging an $800 million operation to manage diplomatic optics seemed like the wrong priority. They would attempt full recovery and deal with consequences if they succeeded. But the fact that the option was considered revealed how complicated intelligence operations become when they exist at the intersection of technical capability and political reality. The CIA wasn't just trying to steal a submarine. They were trying to steal a submarine in a way that wouldn't trigger a diplomatic crisis during a period of détente. When the submarine actually broke during recovery, when Pipe Section 147 failed naturally rather than through sabotage, some CIA officers quietly suggested they'd gotten the best possible outcome. They'd recovered enough to demonstrate capability and gain intelligence, but they'd lost enough that the operation couldn't be characterized as a complete theft of Soviet nuclear weapons. The partial failure had provided diplomatic cover for what was already an extremely aggressive intelligence operation. Whether this interpretation was accurate or just post hoc rationalization remained debatable, but it highlighted a truth that operations like Project AZORIAN exposed. Success and failure weren't always opposites. Sometimes they were the same thing viewed from different angles. Sometimes what looked like failure was actually the best possible outcome given competing constraints. The 98 Soviet sailors who died aboard K-129 never knew their submarine would become part of one of the most elaborate intelligence operations in history. They went to sea on a routine patrol. They experienced a catastrophic mechanical failure. They died quickly when the submarine plunged to the ocean floor. 6 of them were recovered, studied, and buried with honors by the nation they'd been trained to fight. The other 92 remain entombed in the wreckage on the ocean floor, along with the 3 nuclear missiles that represented the primary target of the entire operation. They're still down there. They'll be down there for centuries. But for now, in 2025, 57 years after K-129 sank, and 51 years after the Glomar explorer attempted to recover it, the wreckage remains largely intact. It sits in the deep Pacific, 3 miles down, in cold and darkness and pressure that would kill a human instantly. It's marked on classified maps and monitored occasionally. It's a grave. It's a monument. It's a reminder. The Glomar Explorer operation attempted to steal the past and bring it to the surface, where it could be analyzed and exploited for strategic advantage. It partially succeeded and partially failed. The past came up broken, incomplete, less valuable than hoped, but more valuable than nothing. This is the story of how the CIA spent $800 million to build a ship with a hole in its bottom, told the world it was for mining rocks, and used it to steal a Soviet submarine from 3 miles underwater. It's the story of how they almost succeeded completely and actually succeeded partially. It's the story of how the most expensive intelligence operation in history achieved something remarkable while failing to achieve something more remarkable. The operation ended in October 1974 when the Glomar Explorer sailed away from the recovery site. But the story has no ending. It continues in declassified documents and interviews with aging participants. It continues in the wreckage still resting on the Pacific floor. It continues in the technologies developed for the operation that found civilian applications. It continues in the legal precedents and security protocols that emerged from the operation's exposure. The Glomar Explorer demonstrated that humans could reach the deepest parts of the ocean and recover massive objects from depths that seemed impossible. It proved that elaborate cover stories could withstand hostile scrutiny during operations. It showed that enormous technical challenges could be overcome with sufficient resources and determination. And it revealed that even when everything goes mostly right, the outcome might still fall short of the objective. That's the final truth about Project AZORIAN. It was an operation where almost everything worked. The ship performed brilliantly. The crew executed flawlessly. The cover story held during the mission. The recovery succeeded in reaching the target and lifting it toward the surface. Almost everything worked, but almost wasn't enough. The submarine broke at 200 feet, and with it broke the promise of complete success. The operation stands as a monument to human capability pushed to its limits, and finding those limits just slightly beyond reach. $800 million bought the ability to touch what had been unreachable, but not the ability to hold it securely all the way to the surface. The money bought extraordinary capability, but not unlimited capability. The investment bought success, but not complete success. And perhaps that's the lesson. Not that intelligence operations are wasteful or that technical ambition is misguided, but that even the most elaborate operations face limits imposed by physics and circumstance and simple bad luck. The CIA could build a ship capable of reaching 3 miles down. They could develop technology to grasp a submarine and lift it. They could maintain secrecy during the operation. They could execute every aspect of the mission with precision and skill. But they couldn't control the condition of metal that had spent 6 years in corrosive seawater. They couldn't prevent the submarine from breaking when stress exceeded what corroded steel could withstand. They couldn't eliminate the random factors that determined success or failure in the final moments. They could control almost everything, but almost everything wasn't quite everything. The story of the Glomar Explorer is ultimately a story about that gap between almost everything and everything. It's about the space between human ambition and human achievement, between what we attempt and what we accomplish, between what we reach for and what we actually grasp. It's about pushing boundaries and finding that boundaries push back. It's about succeeding brilliantly while falling short of complete success. The men who planned and executed Project AZORIAN achieved something extraordinary. They recovered a Soviet submarine from the deepest salvage operation ever attempted. They proved it could be done. They demonstrated American technical capability to the Soviet Union and to themselves. They gained intelligence that enhanced understanding of Soviet capabilities. They did all of this while maintaining operational security against hostile surveillance. They also lost half the submarine at the worst possible moment. They missed the primary intelligence targets. They spent $800 million for partial success. They saw their secret operation exposed within months of completion. They achieved something remarkable and fell short of something more remarkable. Both things are true. The operation was a success. The operation was a failure. And that contradiction, That tension between what was achieved and what was lost defines Project AZORIAN more accurately than any simple judgment of success or failure. The 3 nuclear missiles still sitting on the Pacific floor are the physical manifestation of that contradiction. They're still down there, unreachable, not because technology can't reach them, but because circumstances make recovery impossible. The gap between technical capability and practical achievement persists 50 years later. We could reach them, but we won't. The past remains partially buried despite our best efforts to exhume it completely. And perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some things are meant to remain partially hidden, partially revealed. Perhaps the ocean should keep some secrets even while yielding others. Perhaps the most expensive intelligence operation in history was always meant to succeed incompletely, to demonstrate both what humans can achieve and what remains beyond even extraordinary achievement. The Glomar Explorer sailed away from the recovery site in October 1974, carrying half a Soviet submarine and a complete understanding that human ambition, no matter how well funded or brilliantly executed, faces limits that resources cannot overcome. That understanding was worth something. Maybe not $800 million, but something. The operation proved humans could reach the unreachable. It also proved that reaching wasn't the same as grasping, and grasping wasn't the same as holding, and holding wasn't the same as bringing safely home. The gap between those things, between reaching and grasping and holding and bringing home, was measured in corroded metal giving way at 200 feet, in nuclear missiles falling back into darkness, in partial success and partial failure existing simultaneously in the same moment. That gap is where Project AZORIAN lives in history, not in the category of complete successes or total failures, but in the complicated space between where most human endeavors actually reside. The operation attempted something impossible and made it possible. Then it discovered that possible wasn't the same as achievable, and achievable wasn't the same as successful, and successful wasn't the same as worthwhile. These distinctions matter. They're the difference between mythology and history, between simple narratives and complex truth, between what we tell ourselves about human capability and what human capability actually achieves when tested against physics and circumstance and random failure at the worst possible moment. The Glomar Explorer operation was all of these things at once: possible and impossible, successful and failed, worthwhile and questionable, brilliant and flawed. It was $800 million spent to learn that even $800 million can't eliminate the gap between human ambition and human achievement. That lesson might be the operation's most valuable legacy, though it's a lesson that each generation apparently needs to learn for itself. The Glomar Explorer itself was eventually scrapped in the 2000s after decades of service in the oil industry. The ship was cut apart in a Chinese shipyard, its unique features dismantled, its specialized components recycled or discarded. The vessel that had been built to steal a submarine ended its existence as scrap metal. The physical artifact disappeared, but the story endured. Because the story has power beyond its historical details. It's a story about what humans can achieve when they push the boundaries of possibility. It's a story about the costs of that achievement and the limitations that persist despite our best efforts. It's a story about competition and cooperation, about secrecy and exposure, about success and failure coexisting in the same outcome. The operation achieved something that had never been done before and proved it was possible. The submarine rose from 3 miles down, however briefly, however incompletely. The technical achievement was real. The intelligence gained was limited but genuine. The cost was enormous but deemed acceptable within the strategic context of its time. The exposure was damaging but not catastrophic. The legacy was mixed but enduring. Project AZORIAN represents both the heights of what intelligence agencies could achieve during the Cold War and the limits of what even successful operations could deliver. It demonstrates both the importance of secrecy and the impossibility of maintaining it indefinitely. It shows both the power of technical innovation and the humbling reality of physical limits that innovation cannot overcome. In the end, the story of the Glomar explorer is a story about reaching for the impossible and discovering that the impossible sometimes yields just enough to prove it was worth attempting, even when it doesn't yield everything hoped for. It's a story about ambition meeting limitation at 3 miles depth and 200 feet from the surface. It's a story about 98 men who died in service to their country, 6 who were honored by their adversaries, and 3 nuclear missiles that remain on the ocean floor, as a reminder that some prizes, no matter how badly desired, remain forever just beyond our grasp. The operation demonstrated that in the shadow world of intelligence collection, success and failure are often indistinguishable, separated only by perspective and time and the willingness to accept that extraordinary effort sometimes yields ordinary results. $800 million bought a glimpse of the possible, a demonstration of capability, and a lesson in humility. Whether that was worth the cost depends on who's asking and what they value. History records the facts. Each observer must determine their meaning.